my pleasure to introduce John Wallis from University of Maryland. He's talking to us today about rules and contracts, and he is going to be here next week. So if you want to talk to him on Monday, Tuesday, we're doing a book manuscript discussion, which you're also welcome to all day, and then he's here Wednesday as well. So if you'd like to talk to him more, find a way to get a hold of me or him.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Bart. It's great to be here. I've enjoyed it. Bart and I were at a conference together this spring in Chicago, and we were talking about 70s. I said, they're great. I said, my mom lives in Fullerton. I was always like to come out. Why don't you come out for the week? So here we are. This is a paper, I circulated a paper, if people want to read it, that I wrote for a law conference on relational contracting about a month ago. And in the United States, and pretty much in Britain and France, and then later on in other places, they moved to explicit constitutional requirements that the rules be impersonal, that the rules treat everybody the same. In the United States, this is called general laws. So here, if you want to peruse this at your leisure, you can. This is from the Indiana Constitution of 1851. And it says, for these 17 things, the state must pass a law that applies equally to everybody. Now, one of these is getting a divorce, okay, which sounds weird. But in fact, in the early 19th century, if you wanted to get divorced, you had to go to the state legislature and they had to pass an act granting you a divorce, which meant if you were married to somebody politically powerful, you got screwed. Or if you were politically powerful, your spouse got screwed, okay? Because the legislature would actually pass a divorce bill divorcing you. Okay? And so this was an attempt for all kinds of things, supporting common school, providing the opening and conducting of elections of state, county, township officers, that the state could not manipulate this stuff. It could pass a rule, but the rule had to apply equally to everybody. In all cases enumerated in the preceding section, so this is section 23, in all cases where general law can be made applicable, all laws shall be general and uniform in application. And then Article 9, 11, Section 13 was about corporations. Corporations shall not be created by special act, but may be formed under general laws. So what this was saying was that in Indiana, you had to pass laws that apply equally to everybody. I'll have it later on if we need to talk about this in specifics, but in Indiana, before 1849, the typical legislative session passed 700 pages of legislation, 2/3 of which was acts for single individuals or organizations. And all that just disappears. Okay? So the dynamics of politics and economics has dramatically changed. 2/3 of the legislation in the British Parliament in 1800 is for local laws. It's about specific groups giving them benefits and things.
Enclosure, for example.
Yeah, enclosure or estate laws, all kinds of things, turnpike trusts. Okay, so this is really, really important. In Deirdre's bourgeois equality, this is the notion of you're going to have rules that give equal treatment to everybody, that allow everybody to go, what's the word, the phrase, right? And this, right, yeah, have a go, right? And so this, it's hard for us to believe that this just doesn't exist before 1840, but believe me, folks, it doesn't. Even in a place like England, which has laws that apply equally to certain things, the laws do not apply equally to everybody. Okay? And so this is a major transition in human history. I'm not going to talk about it in detail. I've written a lot about it. I've spent most of my life about it. But I want to focus on something different today. But I want to tell you that happened, and we need pieces of understanding how society works in order to be able to do that. I wrote a book with Doug North and Barry Weingast called Violence and Social Orders in 2009. John Thrasher's class is reading it as we speak, or maybe it's not.
They're supposed to be.
They're supposed to be. And what this suggests, the book argues that in the early 19th century, when societies moved to impersonal rules, they created what we call open access societies, in which anybody could form an organization. Because one of the important rules was that Indiana rule about general laws for corporations. All you had to do is fill out a form, pay a fee, and you got a corporation, which meant organizations for all kinds of purposes, churches, schools, manufacturing, businesses, banks, were open. Most societies we call natural states. The rules did not apply equally to everybody. In order to form an organization, you had to get the approval of the legislature or the king or the parliament. Rules applied to different people differently. The famous Ware Guild laws, where if you killed a long-haired boy, you paid 19 gold coins. If you killed a slave, you paid 1 gold coin, right? That literally created identities for people. And there's a big transition. In most of the world today, They're in an identity rule regime. So Erdogan and Turkey, Putin in Russia, Brazil and the car wash, these are all about different deals for different people. When I was writing this for the lawyers, I asked this question: could impersonal rules have a direct impact on productivity of firms and other contractual relationships? And I want to argue yes. This is part of the great enrichment. And I'll argue today that in a specific kind of way, we have organizations and rules, and by moving to impersonal rules, we can dramatically improve the organizational productivity. And you may not believe that now, but I hope you'll believe that by 4 o'clock. Maybe 4:15 or maybe 4:21, somehow before we go, okay? And then, so this is in progress. I mean, literally I started writing this paper beginning of August. I've been thinking about this stuff for a really long time, but I'm going to give you an example in a few minutes that was one of those things that in my mind went click, and all of a sudden I started seeing a bunch of stuff differently. So I'm still learning this paper and this presentation, so things are expanding. And as you'll see at the end, I really think we need to rethink rules in institutions, and we need to modify how we think about them. In fact, the paper that Bart and I were talking about is a paper about rules versus norms as institutions, and there'll be some of that in here. I'll come to that. And I'm Doug North. Doug North was my undergraduate honors advisor. I knew him from 1975 till he died in 2015 for 40 years. And so I'm working through. Doug was great because Doug was always willing to admit that he was wrong. So I'm working on the last cycle of Doug's errors. We'll see that. Okay, so this is a central part of the book I'm going to talk about on Tuesday, Leviathan Denied, Rules, Organizations, Governance, and Social Dynamics. I'm going to focus on the relationships between rules and organizations. And if people want, at the end, I can talk about a larger issue. And I'm going to leave it as an assertion. In the 1840s, some societies were able to do this. Most societies still can't today. And before 1840, even in the US, most rules were identity rules. It really mattered who you were. So in Massachusetts, for example, until 1812, you couldn't get a bank charter unless you were a member of the Federalist Party. If you were a Democratic, Republican, forget about it, okay? So that was specifically an identity rule with a political. And there's ethnic, religious groups, kinsmen, clansmen, all that kind of stuff. We all know about that. But all the rules were in some sense that way. Institution or the rules of the game and the means of enforcement. Either the rule or the enforcement could be identity based. Okay. So rules, and this is for those of you who are philosophers, this is the philosophy part of this, for sure, defining the concepts. All rules exist in the context of organizations. There are no rules that exist outside the context of an organization. Agreed upon rules, whether they're formal or informal, and I'll talk about that in a minute, matter at every level of an organization or when multiple organizations interact. What do I mean by an agreed upon rule? Agreed upon rules are not norms of behavior. They're the result of agreements. Many of us we all are in the United States at the moment. Some of us are citizens, maybe some aren't. How many of you agreed to the laws of the United States? I didn't. I'm subject to them, right? But I didn't agree to them. Did you? You were in Congress for a while?
No, I have to agree
Yeah, you had to agree to that when you need to get in, right?
Yes,
to get your green card. Okay? So I do not mean agreement that we agree that those are the laws of the United States. I mean we have a set of procedures in the legal theorist H.L.A. Hart's terms. We have a set of secondary rules in the United States for determining when a rule exists. House passes, Senate passes, the President signs, the Supreme Court doesn't overturn. We have a set of rules for making rules, and we have a set of rules for changing rules. Okay? I'm not going to get into the normative or moral stuff about legitimacy, but we have a legitimate standard for when a rule is a rule. And if you violate one of those secondary laws, it's not a rule. It's not a law, which Trump found out right away.
Yeah.
Right? Okay? So when I say agreed upon rules, I mean there is an agreement about what the secondary rules are. Okay? And then a rule is agreed upon by the people who the secondary rule says have to agree on the rule. So if it's in a business firm, it might be the management. If it's an economics department, it might be the faculty. Whatever. We all live in organizations that have agreed upon rules. My wife and I are an organization, and we have agreed upon rules. Some of them are explicit. Because we were both divorced. We were a Brady Bunch. She has 2 daughters, I have 2 sons, and we found out when we got together oh man, there's lots of stuff that we thought God meant the toilet paper to roll one way, and it's actually rolling the other way. Is that the devil? No, we need an agreement. We need an agreement about this stuff. Okay, so agreed upon rules. I will argue later, although I'm not going to beat this to death at all today, that institutions are really agreed upon rules. That's what we mean by humanly advised constraints on behavior. It was agreed upon rules in this sense, not unanimous consent, but some agency that we've agreed upon to do that. Aggie and Terrell have this really great paper, Formal and Real Authority in Firms. I encourage you all to look at it. Read the first 10 pages and then stop, because the last part is all to get into JPE, so it's all this formal stuff that I don't think really matters for it. In fact, some of it's wrong. But the key part of it is, and I'm going to change their example just a little bit. Say you have a firm that franchises businesses and is trying to find locations for new franchises. So it has an office, a franchise location that has a manager, and he has employees, she has employees. Okay? So who makes the decision about where the new franchise would go? Well, the rule is the manager makes the decision. That's literally the formal rule in the firm. And if the office picks a location and it turns out to be a bad location, who's responsible? The manager's responsible. That's the way the upper management sets it up. But there's people who work for him, and an Agnion and Terrell setup, which is a little bit simpler because there's only 2 people in their setup. The effort that the employees in the unit put in depend upon whether they have input into the decision or not. So it's actually possible to have a rule at the firm level which says the manager decides, but have a practice in the work unit that the employees actually decide, the manager doesn't. The manager, however, is still responsible for the decision, and if there's a dispute between the employees and the manager, the upper management will always rule in favor of the manager. Agnion and Terrell are very clever at showing that, in fact, you want to pick the formal rule that maximizes the value of the firm, because the formal rules induce what they would call real authority that creates more value. Even if the real rule is inconsistent or incongruent, I will say, with the formal rule. In fact, there's certain situations that having rules that are incongruent is important. It makes you add more valuable if the rules are not the same, for reasons I'll lay out in a few minutes. Okay, so I'm going to develop on this intuition. The reason I'm putting this up here is not to sort of bless because it was a JPE article, is this: if you really get worried about this and want to go find out all the game theory, equilibrium stuff, it's all there. The math is not really important, it's the intuition, but you can do it if you want, okay? So I'm going to try to show today that the distinction between formal and informal really doesn't matter very much. In fact, in some ways it gets in the way. I'm also going to talk about how thinking about a hierarchy of rules, higher and lower, is not a good way to think about that as power comes from the top and flows down the rule structure. It's really natural for us to think of that way. So the title of my book is Leviathan Denied, which is, in order to have a government, you have to have coercive power, monopoly, and violence, because that's how you enforce rules. You threaten to put people in jail and you kill them. And that's not a really good way to understand how rules work. I will still at points use the words higher and lower because they're intuitively, and I'm going to have pictures which have a top and a bottom to them. So higher and lower works that way. But I'm not really going to talk about hierarchy and power here for reasons that I think you'll understand in a little bit. I'm going to talk about the rule environment and an organizational ecology. In an ecology, the darter snail can bring down, the butterfly's wings can flap in Honolulu and there's a hurricane in, somewhere in the Bahamas. So every piece matters, and the interaction of them is what we want to understand, rather than making one piece more important than the other pieces dependent upon it. So in a rule environment, there's multiple levels of organizations. Some have formal agreed upon rules. And the organizations may or may not decide to enforce their rules on other levels of the organization. And these are what we would call default rules. They're rules that are available to people, but are not prescriptively enforced. There's lots of government rules that nobody enforces prescriptively. They go around, the police enforce traffic rules, they investigate murders, but there's all kinds of things which if nobody complains, they don't enforce the rule, even though the rule exists. And a concrete example will help you with this. So I used to work construction when I was in my 20s, and I joined the Laborers and Hod Carriers Union. Jordan was a mason, and that meant I would have worked for him. A hod is this thing that you carry bricks in, or you carry mortar in, and he's up at the top of the building laying the bricks, and you're sweating your butt, you're up and down, up and down, up and down, up and down. That's why you're called a laborer. This is the bottom of the union craft chain. So usually I if I'd known this, I didn't find out until the morning, I didn't want to change all the slides. I worked as a carpenter's helper. I never worked as a mason's helper. And the union rule says only carpenters drive nails. Now, I don't know if you know about nails, but when at home, you get a nail and you go tap, 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 right, until it gets hammered in, right? If you work on a job site, what you do is you take the nail, you go boom, you go wham! Once, right? Twice at most. If you're out there hammering nails 3 or 4 times, you're gone. They're going to fire you because you don't know what you're doing. You're wasting time. Only carpenters drive nails. That's the union rule. And everybody understands that on the site. Okay? But whether I actually drove nails or not depended upon the carpenter I worked for. Okay? Now, there was an organizational psychology that had roughly this abstract 4 levels. There's a state safety commission said you must wear goggles when you drive nails. You must have a hard hat if you're on the site. You have to be tied to a tether if you're 50 feet, 20 feet above the ground, blah, blah, blah. There was 2 unions, the laborers and the carpenters union, that both had rules. There was a construction firm that I worked for, and then there was the carpenter and labor pairs. And because construction work is itinerant, I worked with, over a course of a year, half a dozen or more carpenters and other jobs as well. And every time I went to work for a new carpenter, we had to figure out what's our agreement, what are our agreed upon rules. Some carpenters said, do not ever hammer a nail, do not drive a nail. I didn't drive a nail. Some said, I want to teach you how to be a carpenter, do this. Some others said, well, no, they pick up trash when I tell you to pick up trash, hammer the stuff I want you to do. Every laborer has to have a hammer because mostly what laborers do is tear things apart. And construction involves a lot of deconstruction. And the way you take out nails is with your claw hammer. So everybody had one, but not everybody uses one. Now the key there is that all the carpenters and laborers were unique. No firms had a rule about how carpenters and laborers shared the work. It was unique to every pair. So there was also a rule environment. The state said wear safety goggles. The union said carpenters don't drive nails, laborers don't. The firm said do what the carpenter says, right? And in our relationship, it depended on the carpenter and the laborer and their relationship, what we did. Okay? So this was the rule environment. There's an organizational environment that looks something like this. The reason I have an organizational ecology and rule environment is you can change this without changing this, and you can change this without changing that. Okay, they're really endogenous and interdependent, but they're different things. Doug North and Abner Greif had a big argument, which Abner kind of only won because Doug died first, over whether organizations were institutions or not. So Doug would say, these are institutions, these are organizations. These are the actors that play the game, and these are the rules that structure the game. And Abner said, no, no, this is all an institution. Okay? And I was just about to vote for Abner, and then I figured out, no, these are institutions, these are organizations. But that's, as I said, that's not something I worry about. Doug's 1990 book, called Institutions, Institutional Change and Economic Performance, which is far and away his most cited book, says institutions are the rules of the game, the means of enforcement. Teams are the organizations that play, the organizations are the teams that play the game. That is this. This is the table that Doug wanted to have in his 1990 book and didn't. He's talking about it, but it's not there. Okay? Here's the elements we need. We need the organizations, we need the rules, and we need their interactions. We can not only explain the institutions, we can explain the forces that lead to institutional change. Because Doug said the organizations are the actors, and they have 3 alternatives. They can follow the rules, they can cheat, or they can change the rules. And that gives you the dynamic of institutional change and economic performance. So within this framework, this is new. This isn't the way Doug ever described it, or I ever described it before a month and a half ago. But it captures the ideas that were in that 1990 book. And then Doug, as Deirdre I know, really knows, veered off into cognition and beliefs and didn't come back to organizations until Doug and Gary and I wrote the 2009 book.
Now, may I ask
Yeah.
you, so organizations let this happen, otherwise they don't work. Is that reasonable?
Yeah.
Proposition?
Yeah. And in fact, as we'll see just in a minute, the organizations are actually using these rules, all these rules, not just the rule at their own level.
Okay, by the end, I want you to be able to tell me why his university not
They do. Right, hang on. Wait. You're thinking about rules the wrong way. Maybe. Give me 5 more minutes. Okay. So, in Eggman's role, it matters what matters to the construction firm is the value of these relationships. This determines the productivity of the firm, right? And all the stuff that goes on up above it affects productivity and profitability by affecting these guys, because these are the guys who actually do the work, right? So union rules about driving nails are not usually enforced. You could be on a job site, there's the state safety commissioner walking around, there's union reps, and the state safety commissioner will come right up to you and tell you you can't drive nails unless you got your goggles on. But the union rep usually will not tell you you can't drive nails if you're a laborer. He might. What happens, however, is that the rule structure structures the relationship between the laborer and the carpenter in a way that makes it clear who's going to make certain decisions. Laborers and carpenters are itinerant, they move around. If every pair, when they form, has to have a negotiation over who drives nails and who doesn't, it's going to waste enormous amounts of time. If I work for a carpenter who lets me drive nails for a week, and I come in on Tuesday and Monday morning he says you can't drive nails, and I go complain to the construction boss, hey, we had an agreement I could drive nails and now I can't, the construction boss will tell me, right, colorful language to go away. And in fact, I never do that, ever, if I'm a laborer, because I know it's up to the carpenter. Right? Assigning the authority, this is the decision and knowledge point you were talking about with solar. Assigning the authority to drive nails to the carpenter makes the transaction and the relationship between the laborers and the carpenters clearer, and therefore potentially more profitable. And it does it on a here too. Right? These guys don't waste time. When one of these things comes in, they say the carpenter drives the nail. There's a dispute over who should be doing what. Both the unions, the laborers and the carpenters say, no, carpenters drive the nails. Okay? Yep.
Can I just want to make sure, I think I understand what you're saying about rules, but I want to make sure I'm clear on the contrast class. So at the beginning you contrasted rules with norms, and I'm just want to get clear on what you meant by norms. So do you mean norms as just empirical regularities there, or as...
I'll be clear about norms later.
Okay.
Okay? What I'm saying,
I'm
clear about, they're agreed upon rules, right? There's a structure by which we collectively agree to recognize that a rule has been made. That's a secondary rule problem. And then we allocate to certain people the authority to make rules, and we agree, and that's an agreed upon rule. And these rules are all agreed upon rules. Okay? Whether they're legitimate, moral, ethical, normal, efficient, or anything, I don't care. They're all agreed upon rules. Okay? And I'm going to introduce another twist in a minute, which will help illuminate what we mean by norms.
Okay.
Okay? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay? Yeah.
I'm sorry, just to understand, did you ever identify any rhyme or reason into which carpenters would tell you to drive nails and which wouldn't?
Yeah. But let me come back to that. Okay? So, in the terms of relational contracting, this isn't, whether we talk very much about relational contracting or not doesn't work, but there's an important point. In the typical formal relational contract, like Baker, Gibbons, and Murphy, or incomplete contracts, Grossman, Hart, those kind of models, what happens is we write down a contract, and the contract is necessarily incomplete because we can't specify all the terms of the world. So we find ourselves sometimes, perhaps even anticipating, there'll be circumstances in which the contract will not be appropriate or will be inappropriate. And nonetheless, the value of the relationships between the contracting parties will carry the contract over that gap. Okay? So that the contract won't immediately unravel by people looking forward to seeing that. So you build value into relationships. This has a lot to do with prudence and virtue and the value of interactions with other people. So the relational contracting says you can have a formal contract that's incomplete that works because of the value of the relationships that sustain the formal contract. Lisa Bernstein's work shows the opposite. So she has papers about the cotton trade and the grain trade. There's this really interesting, I like her paper about the cotton trade a lot. Cotton is a very highly variable product that has all kinds of different dimensions to it: length, texture, moisture, color. And so the cotton mills are the people who actually take the cotton and make it into thread and make it into cloth. The cotton merchants are the guys who actually deal with the individual farmers, bring the cotton together and ship it to the mills. Cotton is highly variable. A mill will call up and they'll talk to the merchants and they'll tell them what they want. And then the merchant places the order. They cannot write down exactly what they want. I mean, they potentially could, but then there'd be all kinds of disputes over whether they delivered. And the merchant, in fact, has some idea what's going on. And the mills and the merchants have really long-term relationships. like 3 generations, these small southern mill towns. So deeply based reputational contracting. What happens, however, is that there's disagreements because cotton is so variable, you might not get the right thing, and the temperature may change, and spinning cotton depends upon humidity and all that kind of jazz. So what both the merchants and the mills have done is to create a trade association. And the trade association has very clear rules about how contracts will be enforced. So what happens, the mill calls up the merchant on a phone call, says, I need blank, 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 blank. They send over a copy of a boilerplate contract, which has none of the relevant details in it. But if there's a dispute that they can't work out on the relationships, they go to the trade association. And the trade association has, practitioners. You can only belong to the trade association if you agree to submit disputes to arbitration. If you won't, you're out. Right? So part of being in the association is submitting it. And they have very clear and very impersonal rules that says, what's a contract violation, boom, boom, boom. And they're bright line rules. They're really clear ahead of time. So most of the disputes never go to the association because you can figure out what the association is going to say. This is a case where the association enables people to have long-term relationships who occasionally find themselves in a jam where the relationship is not doing it, to get out, to resolve that conflict by a clear, bright line and personal rule that applies equally to everybody. The big firms, the guys who might be able to influence the trade association, bend over backwards to be disciplined by it, because it's the trade association that enables the big guys to credibly deal with the little guys. Because otherwise the little guys are worried that they're going to get screwed on the contract, and these big guys will be able to hold them over the barrel. So that's a case where the actual market is being supported by the relationships, not by the contracts. And the contracts are supporting the gaps in the relationship. So this can go both ways. It's not just this way or just this way, it's both ways. So that means in the organizational hierarchy, this level could be supporting this level, but this level could be supporting this level. Okay? It's not a one-way street. It's not a top-down kind of thing. You don't want to put relationships at the bottom. And now we get into trouble if we call relationships norms, right? Because these relationships aren't norms, they're agreements. All right, so in general, we could take a functional or view that higher order rules make lower order rules more valuable or a good thing. That's the idea on the control point. But remember, the relationship with the carpenter is an agreement too. It's an agreement, right? We have an agreement about how we do this. So it's a rule too. It's just a rule that only applies to the pair. Any of you who've been married know all about this, right? There's lots of rules that really matter in your life that make you happy or unhappy that just apply to the two of you, okay? We shouldn't get hung up on the difference between formal and informal, because if we do that, we're going to have laws that are formal in relationships with my wife, which are not formal, and then, I'm sorry, dear, that rule doesn't matter. Man, wake up, wake up, wake up. No, your life is hell. As they say, happy wife, happy life. It's a biased kind of statement, but that's true. Right? We've got to recognize that most relationships create agreed upon rules. So you can't separate the relationships from the agreed upon rules. So in both the Egg-Troll example and in the union case, when you get to the union, the carpenter always drives the nail. When you get to the management, the manager always decides. And that's really important in enabling these rules to coordinate within the ecology. What happens if the application of the higher order rule depends upon the identities of the partners? So let's say, like many unions really value seniority. So say I have a really senior laborer, I've been working there for 20 years, and we get paired up with a novice carpenter. And the guy's a novice carpenter, so I know how to do things he doesn't, so he's having me drive nails because it makes it more productive for me to do some nailing. And then there's a dispute, and I go to the boss and I say, look, this guy told me to drive the nails, it's not my fault. I guess they kick it up to the union. And the union says, well, John Wallis, he's been around for 20 years. We know this guy, he's a good guy. And Joe Blow, carpenter here, forget about it. We're going to rule in John Wallis' favor. Then what happens? Now, every single carpenter labor pair has to know who the other guy is. Right? I got to know whether you're a senior carpenter. Now, it could be that's observable. You would see laborers start to put gray in their beards, right? There's all kinds of strategic behavior that's now gonna follow from this. Right, but how do I know? Well, it could be because it's your cousin who's involved in the union, right, blah, 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 all this kind of identity stuff. So now what's gonna happen is that the transactions costs that are being minimized by having a fixed rule are now gonna reappear in an enormous level. So I get, every carpenter labor repair is gonna have to negotiate, the management's gonna have to worry about who we're repairing with who, because those identities are gonna matter, right? And it's really possible that some relationships between laborers and carpenters are not sustainable any longer because the uncertainty about how this rule will work out is large enough to make it unprofitable. And now we get back to the point here, which is the reason I paired with every carpenter a little different way was that made the pairing more productive. Okay? If a carpenter wanted to hammer all the nails, I didn't argue with him because he was going to win. And why spend time arguing? Okay? I wanted to do as much carpentry as I could because I wanted to learn those skills, so I was always willing to do whatever they asked me to do. And sometimes I was better at certain things than the carpenter was. Okay? So that wasn't the only dimension of the relationship. But if you think in terms of Adam Smith and heterogeneity, what's happening is by allowing these guys to have heterogeneous relationships, you're increasing their productivity. I mean, you could think of this, now, I did carpenters and laborers. We could think about borrowers and lenders. We could think about investors and shareholders and managers. We could think about any meaningful economic relationship. We can think about mills and merchants. We can think about suppliers and producers. Any of those relationships could be made more profitable if we can get the right people matched up, or if, given their unique characteristics, we let them pick the rule among themselves that makes them most productive. Okay? If this level rule is impersonal, they can have more powerful relationships. If this level rule is an identity rule, a bunch of those relationships are now off the table.
Sorry, you go ahead. I'm seeing how saying that these are impersonally that at the construction firm level, the carpenter, what carpenter says goes, is a productivity enhancer.
Right.
I'm a little confused about how this driving nails rule is helping, in the sense that it conflicts with the construction firm level rule, and it doesn't seem to ever be active.
No, it's not.
Okay, so like.
So don't be confused, that's the point.
Okay, but my question is, why does a rule, this rule basically doesn't exist? Why does it exist?
No, you're wrong. It really exists, and it's really a viable outside option.
Okay, so it's
Right?
useful for who? For who?
It's useful for these guys, and for these guys, and for these guys. Right? These guys are more productive, these guys make more money, right?
No,
And
but
these guys have their
I'm
needs.
saying that who's using, who is
Everybody's using the rule.
the rule that only carpenters can drive
That's
nails?
right. Even though laborers are often driving nails.
But okay, well, how are they using it?
I've described this, so I'm going to describe it again.
Yeah.
I have a relationship with Vernon.
Yes.
He's the carpenter, I'm the laborer, right? And Vernon says, I'm going to drive nails. I say, that's great. Vernon says, you're going to drive nails. I say, that's great, right? I say, he says, I'm going to drive nails. And I go, okay, I got that. I'll drive nails, but I can't take Vernon. I can't take that agreement to the construction firm of the union and get it enforced, right? So in other words, Vernon and I can have a relationship that increases our value, but there's an asymmetry in what we can enforce. Can this asymmetry actually work? So let me give you another example.
Yeah.
No, because I got to answer this question. Okay. I know, but I have an answer too. I know, but you can answer it in another seminar.
He gets to choose
Right.
whether to use the higher order.
That's right.
Well,
Yeah, we both do.
well,
No, hang on. So let me answer. So the Gavin Wright has this great example from his book, Sharing the Prize, which is about the post-Civil War South. The Equal Opportunity Commission was created in the 1960s to address job discrimination. The EEOC was given the authority to issue guidelines, and there was actually laws that the courts would enforce. The EEOC was not given the authority to prosecute cases. In other words, it could not go into a firm and say you're discriminated. But the EEOC was given the power to recognize legitimate groups of employees who could petition the EEOC to take the firm to court on their behalf. Martin Marietta was a big defense construction firm in the South that was notorious for discriminating against African American employees. The EOC comes in, the African American employees go to Martin Marietta and say, we would like a new deal. And they negotiate a new deal. So Gavin went to interview the personnel manager at Martin Marietta, and it turned out Reagan came in the early 1980s and said, this is the government intervention and abuse of right to contract, blah, blah, blah. And Martin Marietta and other firms said, no, 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 don't take this rule away, okay? And the reason was that the agreement between Martin Marietta and the African American workers did not actually satisfy the EEOC rules. In other words, they were doing some things that were in violation. But it gave the African American employees a credible threat to take Martin Marietta to the EEOC, and that enabled both the firm and the employees to reach a higher level agreement.
Okay, and so
Okay.
in this construction case, it's, so who's getting the credible threat from that company?
Either one of us can go to the union, and what will the union say?
Say, screw you with your labor.
Yeah, say screw me and award it to him. If the Martin Marietta and African employees go to the EEOC will rule against Martin Marietta. They all know that ahead of time, right? And that enables the African American workers to have a credible threat.
I'm not even getting caught up in the particulars of the example. It just seems to me like the construction firm basically is playing the same role as the union, and that they're both saying.
No, the union's playing that role. Because I don't go to the I don't mess with the construction firm. I have an agreement. Sometimes I drive nails, sometimes I don't. I know that when I drive nails, I can't go to the third party to get that enforced. Vernon knows he can always go to the third party to get it enforced, right? Having one party that can do that makes the relationship more valuable than having no party that can do that, right? And in fact, under certain circumstances, having a rule which you don't enforce can get what appears to be a powerless party authority to get a rule enforced in their favor, and that's the EOC example.
I feel like, I think part of it seems like there could be a conditional rule that is.
No, so hang on. I get what you're going to say. So my colleague Peter Morales says, no, I'm not adequately describing the rule. The rule means, oh, if you really want to do this, you can do this, and here's all the options, and blah, 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 blah. That's the full rule.
Okay.
So my wife and I have this rule about the garbage can, which is, if you ask me to take it out, I take it out. Okay? Now, okay? And we have, there's a reason we have this explicit rule. The garbage can bothers a full half-full garbage can bothers my wife much more than me. So I'll take it out when it's full. She takes it out most of the time because it's bugging her and I'm not around. But when she asks me, I take it out. Okay? Is that our agreement? No. It's not. That's not our agreement. Our agreement is I take the garbage out whenever she asks me. We don't have any conditional, optional, other stuff in the rule. Right? We have it in the outcome, but not in the rule.
Nice. So
Okay.
the outcome is
Conditions
conditional.
aren't in her request.
Yeah, that's right. But the rule doesn't specify anything. I got no say over that.
So
Right?
basically, in order to keep the rules simple, you create rules. that
Right.
conflict.
But you no, you not no. The reason you have rules that conflict is that makes the relationships more valuable. Okay? You get it? You get it, right? We think of good rules as rules that enforce equally.
Examples and you're
Yeah.
right on.
Yeah, there's all kinds of examples where you want to have a rule at one level that's inconsistent with a rule at another level, and you can leverage those two things to often support higher value relationships, right? So this is not, we don't want the relationships to follow the rules. We want the relationships to be heterogeneous and unique to the situations of them, which means we can't have a rule which specifies every single relationship.
Fixing authority.
Right, oh, that's the knowledge and decision point. We're going to allocate authority, or we're going to allocate certain kinds of behavior that are default rules that are not prescriptively applied, so people can access them if they want to. The ability to access an external rule, or a higher order rule, can make lower level relationships more valuable, but lower level relationships or rules can make higher order relationships more valuable too. Yeah, you're in the bus.
There are a couple of points, but on this last thing you say, they can also make them less valuable.
Yes, absolutely.
And a perfect example of this is what is claimed about the Chicago Building Code, which is that it's inconsistent.
Right.
So this means that any building inspector can come into a building, any building, and know that there's a violation of the building code.
Right.
Now, what's the result of that? You can go into any building and be bribed.
Right. Oh, no, wait. I'm not trying to say that this incongruence of the rules is everywhere a nice thing, okay? But I am saying there's all kinds of places where it's not a bad thing.
Yeah, I understand that.
And if we believe that good rules are rules that are clear and enforced everywhere,
Yeah, that's correct.
that's wrong. And the World Bank is spending billions of dollars going to other countries to tell them to do that. And we're not gonna get the right outcome if this in fact is the reality. Now, so I've studied institutions and rules all my life. And this really changed my perspective. 10 years ago, I figured out this thing about default rules. We want to have rules that we don't enforce. In fact, Lisa Bernstein's paper has a section called The Economics of Unenforceable Rules, which is precisely about this default rule concept. Hang on, we got Boston, here. Then you're after your
Just a quick one clarification. So I see that the productivity enhancing part is going to be the enabling of the heterogeneity relationship. What is enabling that? Because I heard two things I thought. One was impersonal versus personal identity-based rules, and the other was congruent or consistent or incongruent.
Yes,
These seem to be quite different.
they are different things,
So,
right? Okay, so you can have, the rules at different levels could be congruent and still increase value of relationships. If they're impersonal, they're going to do a better job than identity. Because if I have to know the identity of the person I'm dealing with down here because of how the rule will be applied, I'm going to get all these adverse.
Identity or impersonal could both be congruent or incongruent.
Yes, that's exactly right. Those are orthogonal dimensions of this. They're not, I'm not saying that congruence is good or incongruence is bad. I'm just saying the fact that rules are incongruent doesn't necessarily mean they're bad.
And so which is the one that's doing the productivity enhancing?
Both. Right? Sometimes incongruence can be productivity enhancing. Right? It doesn't. I'm not saying that everywhere in all places incongruence is productivity enhancing.
So I got that part, right? So because the congruence allows the on-the-floor negotiation, right? Because the rules aren't actually telling us what to do, so we have the space to
The rules are telling us what to do, but we're able to negotiate
Right.
a way around that.
So the thing I didn't get was how the impersonal nature of rules versus the personal was supposed to be productivity enhancing.
Because it enables us to reach agreements that we couldn't otherwise reach.
Why not?
Because if I don't know who you are, right, and I have to, let's
But
say,
say that Vernon is senior, so he's
let's just do the
maybe-
simple coast problem. If I can negotiate, there's a 10-cent game, and the cost of negotiation go above 10 cents, I don't do it, right? Because the transactions costs are greater than the exchange. If I need to know your identity here to know how the rule will apply here, the cost of applying the rule goes up. And there will be some transactions that would otherwise be productive that I can't do. In a personal rule regime, I don't need to know who you are. And therefore, those costs are lower. And therefore, there's a bunch of relationships that will come into being that would not come into being otherwise. That's just the simple.
Hierarchies are sometimes nice.
Right.
Yeah, earlier, never mind.
Did I? Okay.
I thought earlier you said it was because if it was an impersonal rule, it wouldn't do you no good. If you're Vernon was the carpenter, you were the laborer.
Yeah.
Right, so if it was an impersonal rule, it wouldn't do you no good to go to the union.
No,
But in the personal rule, it wouldn't do you no good either, because there's no one's going to rule in favor of
Right, no, if the rule is the carpenter wins,
Yeah.
then it doesn't do me any good to go to the union. It doesn't, because we know it's going to win, right? But if I have to know who Vernon is, then maybe I'll go to the union. Because if I'm more powerful than Vernon, they roll in my favor. That's that point. Okay? But that just that uncertainty makes the transaction
Sure,
less.
yeah, got that.
Okay? Okay? Gabriel?
I just wanted to summarize what I understood so far, so, because Nate has a question,
Okay.
I think this question is the same question that I have. So you have a situation in which you need a key ingredient, which is heterogeneity.
Yeah.
That is matches, but the value in a match is much specific. Second, that must be unobservable to outsiders or imperfectly observable. Otherwise, you don't need, I think that's important actually.
Well, it's important in a theoretical sense.
In a theoretical
Okay,
sense.
but in the real world sense, it's always an observable.
Then that's right, that's right, but you
So
know.
who the carpenter is and who the laborer is and how they're going to get along is something you can't.
Hold on,
Right.
so the third thing you need to have is a multiplicity of equilibrium in principle. You can have a certain outcome in a match or another outcome in a match.
Right,
One that is payoff dominated by the other.
that could be.
If that's the case, then maybe on average you choose a certain outcome, that's your default rule. But in the match you want to have high values sometimes. Others can enforce you, so you go with that. The thing that Nat is concerned about, and I understand as well, is why you have a rule up top in the first place. And I think what you're saying is for coordination. You want to have certainty of continuation purpose.
Okay,
Is
so
that right?
yes and no. Yes, in the sense you want to have the coordination, and having the rule up here increases coordination down here. And sometimes having the rule down here increases coordination up there. To actually explain why you have the rule, I got to go into the political economy of rulemaking, okay, which is a little bit more complicated.
But basically, you want to give it certainty, determinacy of equilibrium. Of equilibrium, you want to give a determinate outcome.
Right.
I know that the laborer says, shut
That's
up,
right.
and
That's
the
right.
other guy wins.
That's
So you know the continuation payoff.
That's right.
That seems important. I don't understand
That
why
is really
that's
important.
the key.
Right. That's really important, and why the impersonal rules provide more coordination. Explaining where that rule comes from gets more involved, because I got to explain why there's states and why there's elites and why there's hierarchies. But what I'm trying to get to here is that within this organizational ecology, rules at this level are connected to outcomes at this level. And that's the dynamic I really want to exploit when I go to the political economy.
Now, is the frequency of contact over transactions cost?
Yeah,
And that's underneath this.
that's
a
part of it. Oh,
proposition,
sure,
that's
right,
Go your
absolutely.
example.
Right, yeah. In fact, I'll talk about that
Oh,
explicitly
yeah,
in a minute.
The engineer and the fireman and the
Right.
old steam engine.
Right.
Exactly.
Okay, so now we got, so this is what we've been talking about is the central point of this paper. Okay, that, and here, going back to Baz's point, is that if lower level rules depend on higher level default rules to enhance the value of the lower level relationship, it's likely to be the case that a personal default rule at the higher level will add more value to the lower level relationship than an identity rule. And that's the key point I want to get across, that these impersonal rules really matter to the productivity of every organization that they potentially apply to. Okay. Because, even if they're never enforced or never observed to be enforceable. And then they're, yep.
Want to make sure I understand something about how the default rule works. So you slip between saying that they're unenforced and they're unenforceable.
No, I don't think I
At
did
one
that.
point you said unenforceable, but I don't think you meant
No, I meant
that.
unenforced.
You meant unenforced, and right, maybe they can't always be. They're unenforceable. in the
Oh,
sense
you know
they
what I
can't always
said?
be
I think the
enforced.
title, at least the Bernstein section, is the economics of unenforceable rules, which is a misstatement on her part.
Okay. Yeah.
She's a lawyer, so
Right.
she.
That's what I thought.
No, I'm only talking about unenforced rules. So a default rule, there's always a condition under which it can be enforced, but that has to be invoked. It could be the labor or the carpenter, it could be the firm, it could be the union. And in fact, most rules in the United States are default rules. They only get enforced if somebody goes to the government and complains. There's traffic rules and things that are prescriptive, but most of them are. Nathan and Peter?
So two things. First is a fairly simple, like a very kind of pedantic point, is just saying the rules are, basically, one could theoretically just phrase these rules in terms of options and then not have them conflict, which I think would be kind of, I mean, people don't do that, but it is a sensible way.
Look, there's a way to do that,
Yeah.
right, that twists you up into like a pretzel. Now you talk about stuff, and that's not the way the world works. So let's be simple and say they don't have to be consistent with one another, right?
The other question is,
And
assume,
this is really important for the theorists, okay? Because if they have to have rules that are being enforced, they're going to do a game theory thing, and then they can't have rules like this,
right.
right?
So in
So they have to specify all the options.
Actually, they look like options, but in the real world, they're default.
They're not, yeah.
And that's fine. The other one, the other thing I think might be more important is, so are we assuming here that you have no information about the identity of the person?
No, you might have some.
Because I think that by introducing heterogeneity, you could, in theory, you should be able to, in theory, give better outside options that are more welfare improving to certain pairs than others.
Right.
So there's like two competing effects then?
No, I'm saying that if I have to know who Vernon is to understand how the rule applies,
Right.
then I must find out the information about him,
Yes.
right? If it's an impersonal rule, I don't have to find out the information to have the rule. I might want to find out
Right.
whether I get along well with Vernon, and I may want to, match up with with an appropriate match. So I may devote resources to searching to find the best carpenter to work with. All that's possible in this. This is not about that part of the
Oh.
problem. This is just about the transactions cost of invoking the rule. Okay? That's all it's about. It's not, this is a point about rules and organizations, not about everything. You're good?
Well, it's a kind of a cold analysis.
Oh,
That's
all right.
my whole-
Scott, got relationships in it, and it's really cool.
I know, it's got relationships.
In my life.
But you know, for example, your story about taking out the garbage, I completely understand, having been a husband, alas, no, not alas, is a fine thing. But what I've always been bothered by the way you talk, although you're much better than Doug was in this connection, is that you don't have any story, as far as I can see, about ethics. Now, in the case of your marriage, what we've expressing is that you haven't got any, there's no love as the kind of background and sustainer of this whole constitution about behavior. So, and I worry about that, because then we're off about dealing with details of the game theory, which sometimes is nice and sometimes good to do and sometimes not. But we're the elephant in the room. In the case of marriage is love.
Okay.
In the case of construction workers is professional pride and responsibility.
Right. Gotcha.
So how about it?
Okay. So let's make this husbands and wives. Okay.
Yeah, let's do exactly.
So I got married to a woman named Terry, who I think you met at one point. And she came home one day and said, you know, I've been having an affair with our best friend's husband. We're going to take the kids go off. You'll be happy. You can be an economic historian, go to work, and we're leaving. And I went, huh?
Yeah.
First. And I said, no. Next.
Yeah.
And I went to a lawyer, number 3.
Yeah.
And I explained to her about how I was a morally upright guy.
Sure.
I've been a good husband. I've been faithful. My wife was having an
You
affair.
took
She was
the
an
garbage
adulteress. I took the garbage out. I did the cooking. I did the laundry, all that kind of stuff. And I was sure that when I went to court, that would matter.
Yeah, I know, I did.
And the lawyer said, get real, buddy. That's not the way the law works.
I understand.
What happens is there's a rule for how you get divorced. There's a fixed set of rules that the court will impose a settlement on you depending on your conditions, and you can both go in and see what the outcome will be if you have to go to the judge. Okay, so my current wife's name is Ellen. She was married to a guy whose name I will not say, who was a real jerk, and did the same thing to her that my wife did to me, and we ended up meeting each other. We got married. We're a Brady bunch. She has 2 daughters. I have 2 sons. And you know what we do now? We live in the shadow of that rule.
Yeah,
We love each other,
yeah.
and we work our love in the context of the rules that we now know we live in.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay? It does not mean the existence of that rule has anything that does not matter to love. Okay? Or the value of the relationship. The question is whether the presence of the rule increases the value of the relationship, given that the value of the relationship can come from anything. Okay? And I'm not denying any sources of the value of relationships. My friendships, my knowledge, my caring, my children, right?
Yeah,
You know, and I'm not taking any of that out of this equation. I'm not saying that's not important. Okay? I'm just saying that as a society, we can enhance the value of some of those relationships by placing ourselves in circumstances where there's agreements about how we behave that we can access or not access,
yeah,
right? And I think that's why you have this great enrichment thing going on,
yes.
is that we live in a society where we have access to these options that make our real relationships more valuable.
Now, there's where you and I really disagree.
Okay?
Because I think,
But this is not your seminar, dear Chris.
I know it isn't, but
And we're not going very far on this. You got 1 minute. I'm looking at the clock.
I understand that, but understand that I believe, and so do some people, that the fuel of the great enrichment is not the structure of
Yeah, I know.
formal
I know.
or informal rules.
I know you don't believe it.
And here's my punchline. If you can show me quantitatively that you can get an increase in national income per capita of 3,000% from tweaks
Okay, that's another
in the
paper.
carpenters and laborers'
You're done.
rules,
You're over your time.
then I'll.
I know. Look, I'm not going to convince you of this today, Deirdre.
Well, I know
As
you're
I
not.
told you, my mother-in-law is a Rush Limbaugh Republican.
Yeah.
And she wants me always to convince her that the world is not going to hell in a handbasket.
It's 5
Okay?
minutes.
And she gives me a 5-minute window, okay? Now, you will not give me, I will not be able to do this in 5 minutes,
I
okay?
understand, I
Okay?
understand.
Okay?
But
And this is, Deirdre, as I said, I'm not gonna argue whether this is the source of the great enrichment. I think this, understanding this process is crucial to understanding what happened in the Great
But I'm
Enrichment.
not speaking to you.
No, no.
I'm speaking to all
I know,
these young
but
people.
tell you what, that's, when you're up here, you get to speak to them, now, you're done.
I agree,
Okay?
I agree.
And that's not unfair or uncaring.
I agree by the law.
With our
I don't
relationship.
have any problem with that.
Okay,
I
good,
really agree.
okay. I don't mind talking about that, but in somebody else's seminar, and if you want, at 4:30, I'll talk about some of the evidence that I have for that, but I don't want to do that right now. I want to talk about something that I think is potentially confusing for people, and this is a little bit of a Nate's problem about what the rules are. And I'm going to come back to this explicitly. No, I won't, yeah. Good rules are always enforced, right? That's problematic in this scheme,
You're right.
right? That just, we can't have that there. Doug and the 1990 book is a really good book. It has some confusing parts in it. Doug and I worked on this, the book that I'm writing since 2009, and then he passed away. When you read Doug's 1990 book and Aubrey's 2006 book, when they talk about impersonality in their book, they talk about impersonal exchange. And what they're really interested in is explaining long-distance trade and the growth of relationship trade between people who do not know each other. That's really what they thought was fundamental to explaining modern economic growth. Okay? So they define impersonal exchange as exchange between people who do not know one another. And then this turns out not to translate into the impersonal rule thing. So here's how Doug defined impersonal. He said there's two kinds of exchange, impersonal and personal. But he ended up with 3 kinds of rules. One is personal exchange involving small-scale production, repeated interaction, culture, blah, blah, blah. The second one, therefore, a second general pattern of exchange has evolved that is impersonal exchange, in which parties are constrained by kinship, ties, bonding, exchange hostages, and merchant codes of conduct. Frequently, the exchange is set within the context of elaborate rituals and religious precepts to constrain the participants. Deirdre often writes about this stuff, right? This is not impersonal exchange.
No, you're right.
I do not know you personally, but I know who you are.
Yeah, exactly.
I know who your parents are. I know who your family is. I know who your church is.
I know where you live.
This is identity exchange, right? The third form is personal exchange with third-party enforcement. This is about impersonal rules, is what Doug. Now, I don't know how many of you knew Doug. Doug was about this tall. He was a real curmudgeon. So I called him up one day and I said, Doug, you have two kinds of exchange and 3 kinds of rules. God damn it, no I don't. But Doug had all 9 of his books on his desk. I said, put the phone down, pick up the book, go to page 32 and read it. 5 minutes later, my phone rang. God damn it, you're right. Okay? So now what I'm saying here is between here and here, there's a big difference.
I agree.
Okay? These aren't not both impersonal exchange. This is identity-based exchange and identity-based rules. And this is impersonal exchange and impersonal-based rules. And we need to understand that these are different. When you do Opner's community responsibility system, and then we're grabbing traders, it's all based on social identity. We can have exchange over longer distances and between people who don't know each other because I can identify the people socially. But that means I go to court, I'm a noble, I get a better deal in the Viscount, right? All that stuff is identity-based. It's great for social order because it enables you to know something about how the rules are going to be applied by looking at the other person. But it's not in personality.
Can I make a small point?
Yeah.
And I promise it'll be small and not the old one. Isn't there in the so-called impersonal exchange, aren't there kind of, what can I say, abstract entities like Marshall Fields that act as though personal?
No, those are organizations that have legal personhood. That's a part of the rules. That's a part of the rules, right?
That's what I mean, but then to in a kind of like, you know that the guy's a Jew, so he's gonna pay his bills.
No, there's definitely ways.
Wait,
No, hang on, just one thing. When you move to impersonality, it does not mean identity no longer matters, right? I want to know the identity of all the people I deal with. I want to know who people are. right? Like Joe Reed said, I bought a house, I just went out and bought the first one I found because they told me markets were efficient. I said, well, Joe, if you were stupid enough to believe that, you got what you deserved, right? Do I just, you know, it doesn't matter, I just can be friends with everybody? Because if I pick a person at random, am I gonna get the average person? No, I don't. I go search for the people I like and the people I get the match with, and they do all that stuff. Identity really matters. We meet anybody, we wanna know who they are. We immediately start watching them to gather information about them, right? I mean, look at, some of you haven't even talked, but I've been looking at you, forming opinions about it, right? Identity really, really matters to us. This is not about obscuring identity at all. This is about providing a set of rules that we can access that make the relationships we have more valuable.
But isn't that, so I got to push on, because in some, I was buying everything, but in some sense, that gives grounds to, for example, affirmative action or positive discrimination, right? Because in a sense, it's the same as with the house. You sometimes don't get related to some people,
Right.
therefore we are forcing you, we are going to put a rule
Right.
in which you are forced
Right.
to interact
Right.
depending
Right.
on identity,
Right.
and no worries, you will have higher
Right.
efficiency,
Right.
higher.
Right. So don't try to put me in the box of saying impersonal rules are great and identity rules are not. I'm not gonna be forced into that box. Okay? I'm not gonna be forced into defending impersonal rules over identity, not identity. What I'm trying to do is to say, if we do not understand how this thing works, we're clueless about understanding how society works. This is a tool that we have to understand how rules at the upper levels interact with the rules at the other levels. We have to have it. Okay? So even in a society that says, in America, bourgeois equality, all the rules should apply equally to everybody, which is an 1840 phenomenon, we still have lots of rules that don't. Right? If you're a black man in America, you're what, 12 times more likely, or it's not quite right, 5 times more likely to end up in jail in the course of your life than if you're white. That's because even though the rules are the same, the enforcement is not. So there's all kinds of things about identity. Some identity rules may be really good for certain things and not for other things. I got that. But I'm not trying to say identity and personality are this black and white, good and bad.
Well, no, I think in that way, it's just simply that you are saying personal rules will help you to achieve efficiency. That's why.
Right.
That's what. And I'm just trying to figure out. It's not a criticism, right? I just try to make my mind.
Yeah.
Is just trying to figure out whether these identity rules is always the case that never will create more efficiency. And I'm saying, if the reason why you would go and try to bring more wives in academia, the argument goes, I'm not saying that I buy it or you should buy it.
Right.
It's just the argument goes by, if these women are maybe brilliant, and bringing them in as full professors, that will help change the institution and will achieve higher, more efficient outcomes, right? So that seems to me a counterexample to the efficiency of impersonal rules.
Okay. I think we're
We're
talking past each other.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, because I think the examples are different kinds of examples. There are specific, is there a specific situation in which an identity rule could improve over a personal rule? Sure. The answer is certainly there's a large number of those. Is it the general case that identity rules are better than personal rules? I think the answer to that is no.
Okay, that's okay.
Okay, so a question I'm not going to answer here, but is really important. You want to understand the movement to equality, and they implemented the bourgeois idea in here's the books. At least the powerful guys, usually guys, who enjoy privileged rules and privileged enforcement, they have to find it's in their interest to give them up, or they will not give them up, and you will not get equal rules. Okay, you will not get impersonal rules unless it's there in their interest.
Yeah.
That's why it's important, and we can debate about defining interest, but that's why it's important to see where these potential benefits and rents and interests are coming from.
Yeah, but then you're insisting, and we have a disagreement here, that interest means, say, financial.
No, I'm not insisting on that at all.
Well, but then.
I'm not insisting on that. Deirdre, quit putting those words in my mouth.
Okay,
Quit
sorry.
insisting that I'm a max. I remember the max you gave.
Okay.
Right?
You aren't. That you're sounding like you're sounding like you're. But you I would claim, and you understand this, that the elite was persuaded to some degree.
Yeah.
And it wasn't about any sensible definition of their interest.
Oh, no, I think you're absolutely 100% totally wrong about that.
Okay. Well, then,
And if you want, at 4:30, I'll show you why.
well, we have to talk in detail then about Holland and
We
Frank.
do, and that we're going off track again.
Well, no,
I
it's
don't want
not
to
off
talk
track,
about
it's very important.
You know, it's really important. I get it. Okay. So I have an answer to that, and that relates to your thing about interest and how the multiplicity of dimensions of interest matter to these guys and the problems they're trying to solve. So on Tuesday, I'm going to talk about Leviathan denied. And chapters 8, 9, and 10 are precisely about why elites would move to impersonal rules. And the answer there that you will really like is not economic interest. Okay? It's not the financial monetary returns, it's not the economic rents, it's something else about the dynamics of the political and social system that they're really concerned about.
Ideology.
Well, that's part of it, okay? But that's not all of it. So, but that actually takes a whole lot longer than I have time to do, especially today, because hopefully I've convinced you about something, right? That looking about organization and rules in this way is important, and that thinking about that not all rules have to be actively enforced to be a good rule is really important. Okay, so now I want to come back to that and think about this rule ecology, and go to this, think about the formal and informal rules for a minute. And the more I think about this stuff, the more, this is rhetorical, sometimes we get ourselves tripped up in our own terms. We think something's obvious, and so then we use words like formal and informal and begin to see things, and it's Duck or Rabbit, we keep seeing the duck, when in fact it turns out it was really a rabbit, right? And we talked ourselves into being a duck. So we think about, in this hierarchy in the ecology, so Doug defined institution as rules of the game. Rules are formal rules, laws, coercive backed, and then there's informal rules, which are norms, conventions, blah, blah, blah. Well, so here we have formal public rules, we have formal private rules, we have semi-formal private rules, we have informal private rules. Okay. Now, I want to get to the question about norms here, because I think we needed to get here. Here's formal and here's norms, right? I mean, that's really what that ranking means. And it means it not in just North, it means it in most of the institutional literature. Okay, so formal public rules are more powerfully enforced because they're backed by coercion, so they're more likely to be followed, despite the fact that going up that chart, we're more and more likely to have rules that are not followed, because they're more and more likely to be coordinated rules higher the we go up. The less formal rules are not as powerfully enforced. Disintuitive, it makes sense to all of us, but it's not right. My wife has a real strong effect on my behavior. Right? The fact that we're down here does not mean that the agreements between the laborers and the carpenters are followed less often than the agreements of the State Safety Commission. It just doesn't mean that. I got to work with my carpenter every single day, and if I decide to avoid the rules, our relationship breaks up, and that's fine. I don't wear my goggles and safety hat all the time. Right? Sometimes I fall off the tall building and die, all that kind of stuff. Even though there's coercive enforcement up here, that doesn't matter. And we want to think about how often rules actually result in behavior. We may be talking about these things being really way more important in modeling behavior. I was asking about the rules that university. One of the fundamental problems in sociology of organization, they're stylized fact. So this is Seltzer, Parkinson's, on up through Woody, Powell, and those guys, is that why do organizations devote so much time to writing rules that nobody follows? Right? Why is that? I mean, there's a great Granovetter quote in this book about the paper about near versus far relationships. That's not quite right. He says anybody who thinks that an organization is described by the formal rules is the babe in the sociological woods. Right? So they're trying, and I've been reading a lot. I find these guys really fascinating. I really like their books. They never told me this story about the rule of the upper level coordinating the rule of the lower level. It's not in there. because they talk about the environment and the norms and the behavior and all this kind of stuff, because everything that's not rule-based for them is what? It's a norm. Now, if a norm of behavior, and I'm going to adopt this narrow description for a bit, if we go to the Greif's notion about norms of behavior being a pattern around us, and we go to David Lewis's notion about a convention, and we go that we observe patterns of behavior around us. There's a bunch of behavioral stuff on this, I'm sure, that I learn from my world around me the consequences of certain actions because I see patterns. And those patterns of behavior around me create costs and benefits for certain decisions, ethical, whatever, right? So that as I'm making a decision, there's a behavioral rule which says, not wearing a tie to a formal dinner will get me in trouble. Crossing the street the wrong way. I'm really careful now. I don't tell my female colleagues they look nice any longer, right? Because I'll get potentially in trouble for doing that. I did tell my department chairman, I've never seen you wear a blue dress before, and she said, it's not I said, I've never seen you wear a purple dress. She said, no, it's not purple, it's blue. And I realized I'm never going to say anything about colors to her anymore again. But you see, that's a norm-based thing, right? And you can see why that could be self-enforcing, and the understanding of logic and Lewis with language and Greif, and this whole really powerful notion of why a pattern of behavior can create behavior, decisions that reinforce the pattern is really, 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 really important. Now, this is not necessarily about ethical norms or aspirational norms, it's just about patterns of behavior. This cannot be a norm of behavior because every pair is heterogeneous. The whole point here of the gains of productivity is that these guys are matching up how they interact. So you can't say, oh, there's a norm for laborers and carpenters, because there's absolutely not a norm for laborers and carpenters. And to the extent that you're enabling productivity through heterogeneity, through matching down here, the ability of an impersonal rule to support heterogeneous, more valuable relationships means these things can't be called norms, which means that this is the wrong way to look at the problem. Okay?
They can be called norms, they're asymmetric norms. You can actually write theory based on that.
Look, you can do whatever you want. Okay?
It's a norm. The
What's
norm
a
is
norm?
that once we figure out what our value in the match is, we coordinate on certain equilibrium. If our productivities are not matched up, we coordinate on another equilibrium. That's a norm as well.
Yeah,
And it
but
has
it's-
outside values.
It means
It has triggers.
it's certainly not a social norm.
Right.
It's an individual norm
Right.
that applies to a single marriage or a single.
Right.
It's a general. You can apply in the population. You can have triggers outside.
So I think what we're talking about here is we can call many different things norms, just like we can call many different things rules, okay? So that's why I was really careful at the beginning to say, every rule I talk about is an agreed upon rule. I'm not going to talk about any behavioral rules. I'm not going to talk about anything I infer from my environment about the costs and benefits of decisions. Right? I'm just going to talk about the things that have secondary rules in a society that we've decided on collectively, whether it's within my family, within my school, within my community, within my country, that we have accepted. We could call it legitimacy, but here we're not talking about moral and ethical and normative legitimacy. We're talking about you followed a secondary rule, and that's what this rule was legitimate. In that sense, I think, and we're going to talk about behavioral norms.
So it's okay. I mean,
Okay, right. So I agree that we can debate about what the word means, but we cannot debate the substance of the realities of these patterns. Okay, we cannot call this pattern a norm without doing damage to what we mean by a social norm that's based on behavior, which are really powerful things. In no way am I denying that norms of behavior are really powerful. They are really powerful. And I really want to understand where they come from, because I want to understand the interaction of agreed upon rules and behavioral norms. So I want them to be different things that I can see how they react. John?
So, just to be clear, you said at the beginning all rules are in organizations.
Right.
And now you're giving us a little bit more clarity about what rules are and norms. So that would imply, you don't need to talk about this, but I just want to see if this is what you think the implication would be, is that all moral norms are not rules because they're not part of organizations and they have this behavioral aspect in the way that you were describing. I mean, maybe you don't want to get into the moral theory of this, but I'm just curious what you would think about that.
So I don't want to get into Anglicanism and Episcopalianism.
You don't.
Nor do I, but
I don't know. step aside from this presentation and go to another one. I know that okay, so look, I'm not trying to trivialize this, but I'm trying to come up with the right example. When I'm driving my car, I look at the rule, you know, and actually when the numbers on the sign change, I feel different. Right? Ever had that happen?
You can speak with us.
Yeah. You're driving along at 65 miles an hour, you think the speed limit is 65, you look over, it's 45. Now, of course, you make a rational calculation, I should slow down, but what do you feel inside?
Oh, it hurts.
Yeah, right. So Barry Weingass, who's a dear friend of mine and co-author and everything, we went to Berkeley one day to give a paper. So we drove from Stanford to Berkeley, and we were crossing the Oakland Bay Bridge, and he said, "That's where I got my ticket." And I was like, "So?" And I said, "So you got a ticket?" And he said, "No, that's where I got the only ticket I've ever gotten in my life." And I said, "Barry, you're not driving fast enough. Okay, you're leaving a bunch of your life on the road." Okay, and of course the reason was, was that what happens when Barry sees those numbers change, he gets a feeling inside that's different than the feeling that I get. The feeling kicks in later for me. Okay, now I'm not trying to trivialize this. There's all kinds of habits of behavior that I have with things that I do that I no longer think about because I feel them. Right? I feel uncomfortable doing the thing the wrong way. You guys have things like that you do. Right? That you pick up the pen this way, you do this, you do that. My wife, and believe me, when I got married to my wife and the two kids, we had all kinds of things that we thought were natural that turned out not to be. They turned out to be arbitrary. Now, I don't know about morals and ethics and that. I do know that the emotional content of that stuff is sometimes based upon moral and ethical theory. It is based upon the fact that I do things and I see things and I feel about them that it's an appropriate way to do them. That acquires a moral and ethical force for individuals, right, that would vary if they lived in a different environment or they had a different experience. And I have no idea how to sort that out. So when I get
Very moral
sensitive. So when I get into those questions, I have my own self, real issues about trying to understand how to put these pieces together, and this is part of my effort to disentangle some of the pieces. Okay, but I'm not prepared to go there. It's not like I haven't thought about it a little bit. I don't have. I have a neat answer to this. I don't have a neat answer to that. I think these things really matter, and I'm not denying any of that stuff as being important for why people make decisions. I would really like to know why people form norms in this sense. I would really like to know why people, Doug was really fascinated by why people form moral and ethical preferences in their heads that influence their behavior. Okay? And he really was, Deirdre. You may not think so, you may not like what he said about it, but he wrote an entire book about it. Yeah. You don't like it, I know you don't, I've heard you don't like it, but don't say he didn't. You know what? No, it's not the worst book, because you said that about the 2009 book too. I've heard it from multiple sources.
Oh my
Okay?
Yours was the second.
The second worst book. Okay, but don't deny that he was trying to do it. Yeah. And then here's.
So, one thing about, I'm trying to map up the norms literature with the institutions stuff here. And so you've talked about norms in the kind of behavioral sense, but there's also this way of describing norms in the norms literature where there's a second dimension that matters, which is the sort of normative right? Your predictions about normative expectations of others, and I'm wondering how that maps onto sort of.
Okay, so
it's similar in some ways to the agreed uponness of the rule, but it's not exactly
no agreement.
the same.
Yeah.
And so I'm kind of wondering how that.
So here's what I think about that, and I don't think I understand all this stuff at all. Okay, but when Doug died, I was forced to write all these memorials for him, and I went back and read some of this stuff, and I realized, and I've never been comfortable with this formal and informal thing, and I've really never been comfortable with the norm thing. So I forced myself to really work through, could norms be institutions as humanly devised constraints? And my result was no. That a norm is the result of a human interaction, and the rules of sociological method is a social fact, as Durkheim would say, but it's not a humanly devised construct. And so if we want to have a theory of humanly devised constructs, and we want to have a theory of the outcomes of aggregate behavior, but we don't want them to be the same theory because they're not the same thing. So we call them institutions, and we want to have an overarching theory of institutions and institutional change. We cannot have both of them in there. And I just don't think, I think we can't do that. I don't think we can. And I think what happens is the language is so flexible and used so loosely that we call things, many things, norms that are really wildly different social phenomena, just like we do with institutions. And it screws us up terribly, right? And so this is my attempt to say, okay guys, here's a real reason why rules and organizations, if we think of them as agreed upon rules, we get an insight that we don't get if we don't do that, if we're not careful about it.
Just a quick,
Yep.
so one thing you get with the normative expectations dimension
Yeah.
of social norms is this sort of threshold of sensitivity. So how, right, how high, right, how sure do you need to be that there are these expectations
Right,
in
yeah.
place? Do you think there, it seems like something similar has to be going on with the agreed upon, because these things aren't actually agreed upon by everybody often.
No, I
So
think
is
that's
there-
absolutely
is there a
right.
similar kind of dimension
Yep,
there where?
Yep. No, in fact, there has to be self-enforcing, not in the financial return sense, but people's behavior has to remain consistent with this outcome in order for it to be self-sustaining, right? And I'm not trying to say that in a monetary, financial, narrow interest way, okay?
I see that as agreement.
Yeah.
Consent.
Well, yeah, so there's consent
See,
and
there's
agreement,
consent.
that's right,
I prefer the word consent with
Right.
regard to norm.
right. So there's a little bit of confusion there with Hobbes, because Hobbes really talks about consent, when people consent to give their balance power to the Leviathan. So there's, the words can be tricky there, but I get what you're saying. We consent to live, I don't think there's a social contract, but there is consent, right? There is a consent. We consent to do this, and we have some kind of way to understand how the rules are being made. And the big difference between the United States, where we're making these rules don't work really well, is the other places in the world where they don't work at all, right? And part of development and enrichment is, in fact, acquiring that social capability to do that, even imperfectly. And that's the piece that I'm trying to get at.
Yeah.
So now, just really quickly in the last 5 minutes, I think we have an intuitive idea that institutions, good rules are always enforced, good institutions, secure property rights are always enforced, blah, blah, blah. And, but in the union rule example, good rules are default rules, and what matters is not how often they are seen to be enforced. I mean, it's important for them to be enforced when they're called upon, but most of the time they're not. And the behavior in the union rule does not follow the rule. It doesn't have to follow the rule. So we're deeply in trouble when we go to developing countries and say, we want you to get a rule of law. We want people to follow the rule, and when we see a rule and they're not being followed, we say, that's bad, you gotta fix that. We have no idea whether it's bad. We have no idea what the implications of it are. And we're spending billions of dollars doing that. Okay?
Well, an easy example is very bad rules.
Well, there are definitely bad rules, and there's definitely ability to manipulate the rules. But we get in trouble, I think, when we think that this is a good rule.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, that's a real. There are bad rules. I think Oscar Benavides, the president of Peru in the 1883, said, "For my friends, anything. For my enemies, the law." Right? That's a systematic way of getting bad rules. We're gonna apply, but that's all about identity and arbitration, arbitrariness, right? My identity is our identity. You're not in my political coalition, I apply the rule. If you're in it, I don't. That's all about identity enforcement. That's really what that is. We need to see here this dynamic to think about how we're designing rules. Here, the constraint, now we go back to Indiana, the constraint in Indiana is not a constraint on the rule, it's a constraint on the legislature that says when you pass a rule, it must apply equally to everybody. Right? Not that you must enforce it to make everybody follow it, but that the rule itself, we're going to transform political dynamics when we do that. Just absolutely, the process will be different. Yeah.
Tell me if I'm wrong about this, but it seems to follow from what we just said, is that actually it's a mistake to think we should enforce the good rules and not the bad ones.
Yeah.
The carpenter always drives the nail. It's a bad rule. given that we don't
That's
want
right.
always.
That's exactly right,
Right.
yeah.
But
But it's
so
a
that-
great rule.
Right.
If it's,
What
if
we
it's
need
inter-
is, we need something that whenever there's a conflict, when people can't figure it out between themselves,
Yeah.
there's just some, this could be completely arbitrary
Right.
default thing they can just.
That's
go
right.
with. That helps as a check.
In fact, in the legal, the law and economics literature, there's a series of papers by it begins with a G, about default rules, and they say what you ought to do is make the default rules as nasty as possible, so that people will not invoke them, they'll reach agreements on their own. This is the shadow of the law literature, there's a certain argument there. And there's clearly the notion of the commercial code, that the commercial code should follow, so Hayek, rules should follow practice and custom. No, they shouldn't. There's a whole bunch of rules that are better if they don't follow what people are doing, because they make the patterns that people are doing more sustainable. So this is just a box that we should be opening up. There's a lot more work to do here, folks. Okay? I mean, and there's a lot of work to do on very fundamental conceptual levels. And you know, doing that's hard because you get the stuff. And we collectively, as scientists, need to do this. We really need to rethink some of the concepts that we're using that we think are perfectly obvious. And they're perfectly obvious because they correspond to the observable world, but they don't really correspond to what's going on, right? The observable relationships in the world are not necessarily what's driving the world that we see, and not necessarily what underlies it. So to stick with, oh, there's a Leviathan, what we need for a good government is good rules that are always enforced. We need somebody strong enough to enforce those rules. When Madison in Podius 51 said the first problem is getting a government strong enough to enforce the rules. The second is the problem of limiting it. Then we're off on the wrong foot, because we really don't understand how the rules are working and what would make for good outcomes. And then,
Do you think there are conditions where widespread bribery of public officials is acceptable or even a good state of affairs?
well, there's widespread human history where bribery of public officials is acceptable. Okay? And we compare it to open access societies where that doesn't work. No, those societies don't work as well. Okay? And I don't want to get involved in whether corruption is good or bad. I want to say that if we go to Mexico, where there's widespread corruption about bribery of public officials, and say that's bad because that's not what we do in the United States, that we're failing to understand what's going on in Mexico. Right? Wanting to have a normative, good or bad, is problematic there. Wanting to have an economic efficiency, good or bad, is also really problematic there. Because we need to understand all the dynamics. So, whether, I can't give a universal answer to that. It depends, really. Okay? I mean, I know that I got in trouble once I was in an NPR in Connecticut about corruption, and I was talking about my notions of systematic corruption, which I didn't talk about today. And I said, hey, look, we're way better than Russia. And this guy said, that's a low bar. I said, no, it's not. Russia is the average. It's just like, that's how human societies are. The fact that we were a little bit above that means in human society terms, we're off the charts, right? Because there are no non-corrupt societies. There are societies in which government officials aren't bribed and blah, blah, blah. There are societies in which civil wars don't occur all the time and people die. They're just not. That's economic history. It tells us that. And the more we learn about them, the more we find that out. There's not a golden past. Those hunters and gatherers were killing each other with great frequency. Life was nasty, brutish, and short. Hobbes had that right. So we need to be careful about that.
So like one way of putting the takeaway of this is that, so you've got bad lesson to draw is that good rules are always enforced.
Yes.
But something like the right lesson to draw is that good rules can be enforced, and then really sort of it's good rules can be enforced parenthetically, sort of in ways that don't engender further conflict or something.
No. So this is a problem because this is a piece in a bigger argument that requires more background to understand. Impersonal rules are really crucial, not just because of what I've talked about today, which I think is really important. It's important to understand this thing about the relationship between rules and organizations. But if you think about that, then what it means is that if we go back to this, that there's a connection between the rules here and the relationships here. and the relationships and the rules that we need to understand. So in democracy, when Indiana is doing is not saying everybody must be treated fairly. What it's saying is the legislature cannot pass a rule that discriminates between different people. That changes the dynamics, the secondary rules facing these guys, or the legislature. And that turns out to change the dynamics of how economics and politics interact in a way that makes better outcomes more sustainable. Okay? And we need that, because even when we read bourgeois equality and are convinced by the bourgeois idea, bad governments are appearing all over the place to take it down. How do we prevent the government from taking it down? How do we change the dynamic interaction? And impersonal rules have a big impact on the efficiency of organizations, but that plays into the rules at the top that are supportable and how they interact with the rules at the bottom. And so that's the big payoff to getting this piece straight, is you can begin to understand why that happens. And then you can begin to understand why it usually doesn't happen in most places as well.
Okay, time for one more question.
Okay.
Okay, so I think just trying to rephrase this in a micro kind of theory sort of way. Not exactly saying that you can't have rules based on identity. We're saying that we shouldn't have rules based on identity that's sort of, in the carpenter rule, there is the identity. Because you didn't have one person, the carpenter, that's their identity. The other person is the laborer. So it should be that the identities that the rules take into account should be the ones that are relevant for the relationship.
So, no, I'm not saying, this is Nate.
Yes.
I'm not saying any of that.
Okay.
I'm saying, wake up and smell the roses. This is the world you live in,
Yeah.
right? You don't live in a place where there's one rule maker and rules are applied, okay? That's not, there's rules and behavior, okay? That's not the world we live in. The world we live in is worlds with multiple organizations and highly diverse rule environments, okay? And that's the reality. We're doing a game, we're doing the micro theory thing. We got one rule, one behavior. That's what matters. This isn't that world, okay?
Okay, but I most, like what I was trying to make was what you mean by impersonal versus personal, which is you can still have rules that depend on identity features, even in your example you do.
Yeah.
But the question, they have to be ones that are sort of observable on people in the relationship and important to the relationship in order for them to work properly.
I don't really want to go where you're at, okay? Because I want to say we got to look at rules and organizations interactively in this dimension. And so it's really difficult to do the abstraction and get rid of 3 of these organizations and 3 of these rules and see what the relationship is with their identity or not. What I'm saying is that in this environment, the rules at any level that are impersonal are more powerful coordinators for other levels.
But at the same time, that's unfair as well, because at the same time you want us to draw general conclusions from your example on how organizations work.
Right.
And that's what he's trying to do, right?
I guess. We get stuck sometimes in wanting our theories to be too simple, right? And so I want to make a comparison between identity rules and impersonal rules, and I want to make a general point about them. And I can't do every case kind of thing. And I'm not trying to make a theoretical statement beyond just the fact that in this kind of circumstance, the coordinating powers of impersonal rules are greater. Okay? I think that's actually a generally provable notion. And if Aggie on its roll wanted to figure it out, or Bob Gibbons wanted to figure it out, or maybe Daron Asamoah will wake up in the middle of the night after I talk to him and write down the model and be done. It may be possible to figure. I think that might be a generally analytical solution, but I also wouldn't be comfortable with saying, oh, therefore all rules ought to be impersonal, because I don't think that's a sustainable
It's
outcome.
context specific.
Yeah, right.
See, the building code.
Yeah.
Chicago, they're context specific.
That's
The
right.
context is very different. That's not a profit firm, that's
Yeah, right.
involves the government.
Right.
So all is fine. And you see, that's what, I learned that from Adams in the theory of moral sentiments. You see that in Smith's notion, you see there's no conflict between general rules and diversity because context matters. So So within general rule, you can have a lot of
Yeah.
diversity because the context is different, but it doesn't
Yeah.
mean that there aren't general forces.
So I think this is different than that. I'm really saying here that you have a hard and fast rule in which context doesn't matter, and having a hard and fast rule in which context doesn't matter can enable you to have more valuable relationships in the context. That's the trade association. But we're going to enforce these contracts according to well-specialized bright lines, and that's going to enable more heterogeneous relationships to be sustained. We're not, see, this, we want the rule to fit the context, and what I'm trying to say, no, the rules aren't enforced very often. And so when they're enforced, they don't want to be context dependent in their enforcement. They want it to be clear, bright line.
So,
Okay?
I think you convinced everyone that sometimes impersonal rule, I mean, everyone I think would agree that sometimes impersonal rules are beneficial.
Right.
The question kind of one is, like, intuitively, when should that more often be the case? When should I expect that to be true? But that the impersonal rules are going to help that.
I don't
That's
know,
what I
I'll
was trying to
think about
get
that.
at.
Barb will send you an email when I get the answer. All right, we're done.